Project, and I'm a co-founder of the project along with Rami Kalir. I'll be the host of this conversation. We've got a terrific panel here to discuss this month's reading, which is entitled Even So Cinderella is White, Recentering Black Girls' Voices as Literacies of Resistance. Written by Jemima Young, Marquita Foster, and Dorothy Hines, who have all been gracious enough to join us here. So I'd really like for everyone just to very briefly introduce yourselves.
Hello, my name is Marquita Foster. I'm a teaching fellow at the University of North Texas.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Hines. I'm an assistant professor in African Studies at the University of Kansas and also an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching at the University of Kansas.
Hi, I'm Mimi Young, Jemima Young. I go by Mimi, and I am an assistant professor of multicultural and urban education at the University of Iowa.
And I'm Christina Cantrell. I'm with the National Writing Project and really excited to be part of this conversation today.
So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And I'd like to ask you now to just give us some background on this piece. You can share anything you'd like in terms of your process for writing together, maybe some of the research that went into the piece.
So this project is part of a larger project that most of us are still working on as a team. And it started in looking at literacy education for Black girls. We all kind of began to work together, and we piloted the counter fairy tale narrative with a group of teachers and students. And Marquita Foster is actually one of those teachers, and I'll let her share a little bit more about that. But we found that a lot of success with this counter fairy tale model. And we also kind of triangulated that with a few other kind of theoretical notions, specifically when we look at like counter narratives and the oral storytelling tradition that's so common within Black culture, as well as counter fairy tales, which are European stories, but something that white teachers, something they're familiar with to help kind of bridge the gap, the divide, if you will, between teachers and learners.
And this is Dr. Hines, and just from what Dr. Young has stated, this is about not just what teachers experience, what educators are already, some educators having conversations about, but we also wanted to connect what's happening in schools to what's happening in society. So even when we look at the state of Black women and girls in the larger United States, as well as internationally, we see that their narratives are not being included. Their narratives in so many ways, if they are included, are not being taken with the authenticity that's required to really necessitate change. And so we wanted to make sure that we are not acting like schools and society operate as two separate places, because they don't. We know that in many ways schools mirror society, even when we think about in terms of the prison population, when we look at the ways that young Black girls as well as Black women are being arrested and treated by the police. We see a lot of that mimic also in schools, in which the ways that school resource officers treat, surveillance, and criminalize young Black girls. And so we wanted to make sure that within this piece that is ongoing, that we not just think about schools as its own separate place that is devoid of what society says, that is devoid of what society does, but that in many ways schools and societies operate together. And so in this piece, we wanted to make sure that we brought to light the injustices, the inequities that Black girls experience in schools, and really mirror that to what we have seen historically with slavery, but also contemporarily. We see different versions of this afterlife of slavery playing out in schools in terms of how youth are treated, arrested, criminalized, and in many cases miseducated as well.
And this is Marquita. When Dr. Young presented this, there were a group of, I believe, about 20, maybe more Black educators in the room, and we were all very excited because we had not seen anything like this before. And so I, told her I'm going to take this back to my school district and see what happens. If you know anything about Texas, we're a big testing state. We have the big state test every year, and we drill and kill, students with a lot of preparation and practice. And my teachers, of course, like many teachers across Texas, you have a group of students who just cannot grasp the content, and they don't score well. And so we pulled together a group of students who had not passed the reading assessment and decided, rather than giving them the typical traditional reading passages that they could not connect to, they, hadn't proven to connect to, let's give them something that they could take and make their own. And that's where it went from there. And, and we were, trying to close the reading gap, I guess you could say, or make sure these students were able to pass. What came out of it more than that, though, was this identity that we do matter, we do belong, here are our stories. And the students in that remediation session were so excited to be able to tell a story that was a familiar story to all of them, but able to tell the story from their perspective and use the knowledge that they had already had, but wasn't able to transfer that knowledge on a reading test that was so had literature that was so disconnected from their realities. And so it was very successful with that group of students. Yes, they all passed the second time around, but it left a lasting impression with them about being able to see themselves and write about themselves and hear their own stories and share their own stories. And, it made them, and this goes back to what Dr. Hines was saying, typically when we pull these students for remediation, they're separated from everyone else and they feel different. They feel punished. And so it's very typical in the school system that happens. And that time that we had with them, it made them feel less different. It made them feel important. They were doing something different and they were still learning. And it became less oppressive for them and more engaging for them. And that was probably the best part that we got out of that, is that how they felt about in that session doing something that was relevant and important to them.
And I think that's the key piece, right? First, we have to say that young Black girls have stories to tell. We have to start there. So a lot of times when we think about schooling, it's about this idea that, is through public education. It's for the greater good of society. It's so that we have this educated citizenry. But then we have to think about, but who are we wanting to educate? Who do we determine and deem to be citizens? And what information are we educating them with, right? So we have to really rethink this idea of education, not as something in which kids are just sat in the classroom desk. They have to sit still. They have to raise their hand. They cannot move. Teachers hold all the autonomy in the classroom. And the only story that they hear is from a textbook. No, I would say kids come to schools with their own stories and experiences about life, about cultural knowledge that we don't want to tap into or allow them to have access to share with others in the classroom. And that includes not just with other students, but also with the teacher as well. As we know, predominantly teachers in the U.S. public school system, and largely in mostly all schools, even private schools, we think about charter schools, are majority white teachers. And so if they do not have not just the preparation, but the experience, the wherewithal to say, hey, I need to know more. I need to learn from these students. And that's just not having you sit in my classroom. You could sit in someone's classroom and not know a thing about that child. It really takes you as a teacher, as an individual saying, I have something to learn from this Black girl today. I have something to learn from the Black community tomorrow. I have something to learn about African American Black students from 200 years ago. There's something still to learn and know. And when you take that perspective, then you start to realize that those individuals come with a narrative. But when we see students not just as students, we don't see them as human. We're not going to say something that's not human can talk. We're not going to think that something that's not human has a story to tell. So there's certain attributes that we even give students or that we deny and take away from them because we don't see them as human to begin with. So if I don't see you as human to begin with, why am I then going to say you have a voice and a narrative and a story to tell? So we have to start somewhere, and it has to include those counter storytelling narratives that students and communities of color have, but also, as we have in the article, about these counter fairy tales. There's other tales to be told. And I think when we think about how that comes out in society, young people, it comes out through cell phones. They're recording their own narratives. They're creating their own archives because we want to allow those to enter the classroom, or we don't want to hear them to begin with. And so I think that what Marquita really brought up, which was excellent, about this idea that we have to say that those narratives exist and they matter, because they do. And so as educators, we have to think differently. But I would also say sometimes it's not thinking differently. Sometimes we don't need to be in the classroom to begin with. You only can train enough, right? You only can do enough. But while students are going through those classroom doors, what do we do now for the students that are in these classrooms today? What do we do for Black girls today? And I agree, it starts with, one of the starting places is really validating their narratives, validating their humanity, and decriminalizing these spaces that we create for them, and then say you're supposed to be educated here and be happy with it.
And I think just to kind of bring it all together, and piggybacking off of what both Dr. Hines and Ms. Foster have said, you know, we describe counter in the storytelling as stories that offer a resistance to the dominant or traditional narratives. And I think that resistance is key. The resistance as a notion, as a concept, implies or infers that there is some degree of power there. And when you have Black girls that are in classrooms listening to these facts and ideas and concepts and practices that are not culturally affirming, that don't hone their cultural funds of knowledge, what are we really doing to them? Not only miseducating, but it creates trauma for Black girls. So these counter fairy tales are so incredibly important because it places the power, that onus of responsibility within the Black girl. And so being able to create these stories using something that is familiar to the teacher in some respect, but completely culturally affirming and completely supportive of what their experiences are, is something that gives power to Black girls. And I think, to me, that is the most one of the most important components of the framework, giving that power back to the community, giving it back to Black girls. And another thing that we saw, and I hope we can get into this maybe a little bit later, is that within Black culture, there's a sense of, it's a communal, familial type of writing process. And so many of the Black girls that we piloted this with, they would go to their elders, they would go to their church, they would go to their community, they would go to their parents, they would go to their friends. And it wasn't just them writing the story. The story was reflective of the Black community. It was reflective of not only their lived experiences, but their histories. Just to kind of piggyback off of what my co-authors have said.
Well, that's really a helpful background, and I appreciate the, I think that in your introduction of the piece, you've really, done a nice job of painting for us broadly the really important criticism that comes at the outset of the piece. Is there anything else you'd like our readers to know in terms of background about this piece, or maybe even the process of writing it?
Well, I would say one of the issues that I think a lot of English language arts classrooms and educators and students face is really surrounding this language of what is considered seminal pieces in English language arts, what is considered valid, as Dr. Young has stated, cultural funds of knowledge. And so even within schools, we still see middle schools, high schools, we see ethnic studies bands, in Arizona, we see a control over what is considered valued knowledge in ELA classrooms. One of those starts with these pieces like Huckleberry Finn. Some of these discussions starts with, why aren't we using literature and poetry and readings from Black authors or authors of color? And so even when approaching this piece, we wanted to highlight not just what Black girls need, but also what schools are doing that needs to be repaired. And a lot of that starts with not just the textbooks, but the books we use, the language around the books we use, how we classify and define what is English language arts versus what is not, the discussions that we allow in the classroom versus discussions that we don't. A lot of that has to do with the teacher. A lot of that has to do with the school policies surrounding what is considered valid text in the classroom. And so I know in my experience working with high school age Black girls, there was a big school issue surrounding the use of Huckleberry Finn. Why are certain books allowed that say the N-word? How does that make Black students feel to hear that said by a white teacher in the classroom? And so, as what was previously stated, these are discussions that are already occurring, if we're aware of it or not. And so I think when approaching this piece, it was really about bringing those discussions to the forefront, talking about it from different perspectives and opinions, but also validating those perspectives and opinions as well.
What I found interesting is that when I, took the assignment and I brought it to my teachers, at the time I was an assistant principal at this school. And I'm in charge of distributing all of the instructional materials. And as we were going through what was available for social studies, what was available for English language arts, very few, if any of it, was culturally relevant. So teachers, in many cases, are given a curriculum and told to use it. It depends many times on the principal who gives teachers the power to choose something else. And so while one reason I was really attached to this is not just giving those students something else to look at other than the traditional passages that were in these workbooks and consumables that teachers have been using year after year, but also giving those Black teachers something else that they could use and feel empowered to do so, that it did not have to be in this STAR prep book or in the STAR practice textbook, that they could actually go and find those stories that those students could relate to and allow their other, their voices, or representations of themselves to be found in something else other than what the school had given them. And so it's exactly what Dr. Hines was saying. It's mushrooming into something where it's taking every stakeholder who's involved in the life of that child to say, we must present them something else. We can't keep giving them the same text that does not represent their own experience, that shows them a reality that's maybe so foreign to them or offensive to them. I've had teachers who will fight, or I've had teachers who will fight to include Helen Keller, a passage on Helen Keller, but if you ask that same teacher to, present a passage maybe on Harriet Tubman, you feel some resistance because they're unfamiliar with that. And so it's even breaking down those barriers within those teachers to, even Black teachers, by the way, also say, look, you can do this. You have the power. So for me, it was about also giving the students something different, but also giving the teachers permission and empowering them to choose something different for their students.
I would say that one thing I think is so powerful with this model that we learned as we piloted it with different groups of students and teachers is that it not only is a way of teaching Black girls, but it is also a way of teaching teachers. And so oftentimes when I do like a lot of my work, I do like, I'll do professional developments in predominantly, white faculty settings like, an elementary school. And what you'll find is that teachers say that they have this desire to want to support, help, provide, educate Black students, particularly Black girls, but that they don't have the know-how. I won't go into that, segue into that conversation because that's a whole nother talk. But I will say that through this model, what I saw in the feedback that we received is that these white teachers got to see what the differences were between their own cultural experiences and that of their Black girls in a way that is affirming to the Black girls. So then there was a sense of buy-in from them. So for instance, just a kind of example, because some people may not be familiar with the model, the counter fairy tales, what it does in short is it takes this notion of a traditional fairy tale, which is what white teachers are generally familiar with. They're European stories. And it allows Black girls to rewrite the story in a way that is, culturally relevant based on their experiences. So I usually use the example of like Cinderella. So in the story of Cinderella, she has, this evil stepmother and stepsisters, and she wants to go to this ball, and she has a fairy godmother, and she's getting dressed and ready for the ball. And the whole segment of the story is about her dress, and all these animals and whimsical creatures are helping her, prepare for this event by getting her dressed together. And what we found is that for many Black girls, when they rewrote the story, it was not about getting their dress together, right? It was more about getting their hair did. Okay. And that in and of itself became a little problematic for many teachers because they were, okay, that's great. They focus on hair, but we need to say, getting your hair done, not getting your hair did. And so there was some pushback there, and we had to educate the teachers. No, this is a, colloquial expression, getting your hair did. Okay. Getting your hair done and getting your hair did are very different things. And we explained an example of that to them, but it allowed the girls to use their own vernacular, to use their own ways of being in a way that it affirms, it documents, it creates a sense of community. And not only being able to write the stories, but then also reading each other's stories. And we even had a couple of groups where most of these girls were middle school girls or high school, but mostly middle school. And they would go back and read them to elementary Black girls. And so for it to come full circle, between the teachers and the students and, generationally, as well as, kind of creating this new pipeline of rewriting the stories in a way that create, again, going back to that resistance to not just traditional stories. I want to be clear about this. We're not talking about stories. We're not even really talking about literacy. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about who Black girls are and going through an education system that they feel that doesn't support their needs, that doesn't educate, and not only not educating, but oftentimes miseducating and not being able to connect with the things that they're seeing or the things that they're writing. I remember I was sitting in one of the things that prompted this model. I was sitting in an observation and I was watching this teacher, and she was talking about like jumping in puddles of mud. And I could just see the expression on these Black children's faces, because in my home, okay, if my children jump in mud in their church clothes, it's not going to be something fun. The outcome of that is not going to be something fun. Okay. because they will be disciplined. There will be consequences for that. Whereas what they were reading in this text, it was very much a fun experience. It was play. It was something, I guess, that's common in whatever culture that was reading about. Not in my culture, not in my home, I will say. So just the kind of example, some of the examples that were common that came up with Black girls.
And I would lastly add that, it's not just about the Black girls and the teachers, but also our social location, our positionality in this. And so in thinking about this, what we brought to this was our own experiences and understandings with education as Black women, but also as, those who have PhDs, who are working in the field of education, who have served as an assistant principal, currently a faculty member. And so in approaching this, we also pulled from our own cultural, gendered, raced, minoritized experiences as well, which for many of us was not squeaky clean, right? We didn't necessarily easily transition through this predominantly white schooling system ourselves. And so we did draw from our own experiences, our own cultural histories and knowledge about what it is to be Black, what it is to be a Black woman, what it means to be a woman. And we wanted to make sure that we highlighted the girls' experiences through a lens that we use from our own. Even as authors, as researchers, we have a background that we're viewing the world through. We have a background that we're viewing the world from. We have our own lenses which help to color, but also bring out certain things that maybe others may have missed or wouldn't even see to begin with. And so I do think just our own positionality definitely played into how we approached this work, how we thought about, conceptualized this work, but also in the ways that we summarize certain strategies that educators can use in trying to continue and deepen this work to help support Black girls.
So I'm really appreciative of that thorough introduction and also, discussion of the larger issue. This is a point in the webinar where we usually like to just give the background for why we're here and what brings us here in terms of our purpose monthly with this syllabus. So Christina, would you mind just explaining a little bit of the background before we dive into our readings of the piece?
Sure, happy to do that. Happy to also say that Marginal Syllabus was really designed and developed originally by Joe here and Remy Collier as an opportunity to really do kind of multiple things with the ideas of the margins, right? So bringing conversations that often are in the margin of our educational practice and teaching and learning to the center was really a key idea of the Marginal Syllabus. Another key idea was that we would use a tool, online tool, to annotate in the margins, as well as using a tool that is open source and supportive of our own agency as learners in online spaces. So the Marginal Syllabus project got born out of these ideas, and more recently we've been collaborating with the Marginal Syllabus team at the National Writing Project and also with partners at NCTE. So this last year we've had a syllabus that's called Literacy, Equity, and Remarkable Moves. The acronym is LEARN. And we've really been looking at issues of literacy and equity throughout the year with a variety of authors and responders, people annotating in the text. So this month, this article is being featured at our educatorinnovator.org website, and we will post this discussion with the article. And the article is now linked to via the Hypothesis tool, so that when people link on it, they can immediately open up the annotations. And so the invitation is to spend the next month discussing these ideas and talking about this work together. So it's really wonderful to have this kind of context from you as the authors, and to be able to open up these discussions with your voices in these multiple ways. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, and I want to echo those thanks and just kind of comment on what I think is, just broadly the importance of this piece. I really feel like, the interest that brings me into this project is my desire to be, smarter and smarter about anti-racist pedagogy and how to best work in, and serve the students who are in front of me. And I just think your piece, because it's such a direct critique, is just a gift to educators who want to get smarter about anti-racism. So I think it's really vital. So it's really awesome that you've allowed us to annotate it in this way and convene a public discussion of it. And the background you provided already in this webinar, I feel is also a gift. So this is the place where we normally just transition to a little bit of a loose book group discussion of the piece. I always like to show off the idea that I've read it and made markings on the page, mostly because we might talk a little bit about our processes as we read and understand this piece, and the idea that we're inviting folks to come into a digital space where maybe their initial markings might become sort of more refined, and hopefully that conversation that materializes in the margins of the piece will be reflective of people's learning in response to this important text. With that said, I think the thing that I wanted to ask you first as a reader is, I guess I noticed both the idea that you've identified the English language arts classroom as a place for potential innovation or potential progress, and also a place that's really problematic for Black girls. And I wonder if you could, talk a little bit about, sort of navigating the idea of there's hope for schools, yet this important critique, demands an audience. So maybe you could just talk about the balance between the hope you're seeing as you identify, an important practice like counter fairy tales, and then also how you balance that with the important critique.
What could you reiterate what you mean by the important critique?
So the idea that the critique of that I read about the English language arts classroom, right, and how it marginalizes Black women authors and traditional syllabi, right? So that important critique of the English language arts classroom, even as you identify it as a place of opportunity.
I think that one thing that's important to note is to place yourself in a classroom setting. And I think a lot of times as academicians and researchers, it can be hard to imagine what the experiences are of others. One, if you've never lived their life, but two, just kind of being removed from a K through 12 setting as a student. But if you think about children spend most of their time in schools. And so as a Black girl, if you're sitting in a classroom and every part of your day in that literacy classroom goes again, you believe in what you know to be true. Every time you say to your teacher, "Miss, can I ask you a question?" And they say, "Do you mean, can you ask me a question?" Okay, even though they didn't vernacular, my disposition, my voice is silenced. It doesn't matter. And in many instances, what is being, persistently communicated to Black girls is that their literacy and the understanding of literacy is wrong. And so if my mama says X, my grandmama says X, my pastor says X, my coach says X, the only person that doesn't say X is you. And I really don't care for you. What does that do for me to have to sit in your classroom every day, day in and day out? And when I don't comply to your ways of being, then I'm in trouble. And I receive discipline and consequence, and or I'm placed in special education. And these and that as acting out, I then become violent in your eyes. And it just perpetuates this notion of criminalizing Black girls. And then between all of this, where is learning occurring? Where is the learning happening? So,
Amy, you're going in and out a bit. So, I don't know. if anybody else wants to jump in.
This is not just in a classroom. This goes far beyond the classroom context.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, Mimi, and I noted that in the article you actually name English education itself as something that's a patriarchal term, and the sort of afterlife of slavery that this all, and colonialism, I'd say too, that this all sort of unfolds from. I think that's really critical for us as educators thinking about literacy to grapple with those realities.
And when we say English, who's English and what
Right.
English are we talking about?
I see, as someone who was an English major, English teacher for many years, I see this also as a larger something that colleges and teacher prep programs need to acknowledge as well. Because, right now as a teaching fellow, I work with pre-service teachers, and the one thing I try to make clear to them is in others' cultures. And I find that many of them, don't have that understanding, particularly those who are strong literacy people, that, there's this idea of standardization, standard language, standard, just these standards that show that, if you are able to meet these standards and somehow you're capable, you're more successful, you're ready to progress from one level to the next, and not understanding that many children are capable of doing many different things, even though they may not meet those standards. And I find that those who teach English, like Dr. Young said, they find themselves correcting students, and assuming that the intelligence is not there if they're not speaking in a particular way. And that's something I try to make clear to my pre-service teachers all the time. Understanding students' funds of knowledge, understanding that they're coming with a great deal of knowledge already, and how do you use that in your classroom rather than rejecting it and saying it's not a part of the standards or a part of what's acceptable in classroom. That goes to the literature as well. There have been some pre-service teachers who we had a discussion about the classics the other day. And I had one teacher who said, well, of course, I think they need to learn Chaucer and Homer and Shakespeare. And I said, why do you feel that way? And she said, well, the themes that are come out of those works, they're still relevant today. And then I had a young Hispanic pre-service teacher raise her hand. She said, but there are other stories that have the same exact things. They're more completely relevant, and that the students can still learn from. And so that shows you that even those who are becoming teachers or want to become teachers have to be educated as well on how to be more cognizant, more culturally competent about others and their abilities in the classroom. And you will, that particularly goes to language arts teachers and history teachers who tend to stick to certain ideologies or time frames that they find important and that they find relevant.
And I just want to reiterate one more time, when we say things like, correcting students or not affirming them, I think, I recently moved to Iowa and from Texas, and the cultural shift is very different. And here, in Texas, people are very direct. And in Iowa, it's what they call this Midwest or Iowa nice. It's very passive aggressive. And so people will smile a lot and say things that they don't mean. And, racism with a smile on your face is still racism. And so this isn't about being nice or being kind or pacifying the issue. This is about really affirming. We're moving beyond this, neutral place of not causing trauma or damage to Black girls, but they need to be educated. They deserve this, the same affordances and opportunities to learn in ways that are culturally not just relevant, but culturally affirming. I can't emphasize that enough.
And I think that's important, because how do you, it goes back to the idea of culturally relevant pedagogy, or Django Paris, Dr. Paris, former professor of Michigan State, calling it culturally sustainable pedagogy. How can you teach something you don't know? How can you teach to people you don't think really exist, or you don't personally value, or your community you grew up in didn't even value? So if we want to not just teach relevancy, but also something that's sustainable, it requires us to take a different approach. And it has to be something that is dynamic, something that we have not done before, right? The status quo cannot continue to be just the status quo, and our children are just supposed to be left with it. Because for, something like this, we talk about Black girls. I'm the mother of a 4-year-old Black girl. And so I take this personal when we talk about educating our children. We're talking about educating our children. That means something. But it also means something for teachers, in particular white teachers, to think Black females are still their children. We don't hear that language. We hear our children, and they're not talking about communities of color. And so I would hope at some point we get to the day in which we say, white teachers, white educators, that Black girls, Black children are also our children. Because then that requires a different approach in which the status quo, the mainstream curriculum that we want to use, that is damaging and is racially violent to our children, will not continue to exist. That's the point that we have to also get to. We can't see cultural relevancy if we don't think you're human, if we dehumanize you with our words, the language that we use, where a child can't say, I got my hair did. Like people say today, I did that. I did that. There's something called, with Geneva Smitherman, who's a researcher professor at Michigan State University, talks about Black English. When we look at even the literature, when we look at cases, there was a Black English Supreme Court or Black English case that took place in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So you also have Black communities, Black parents that are fighting for the right for their child to be able to use the language that their communities, their culture, and their history says is also valid. So we have a lot of dual things going on here. And I think that was the question, really gets to, is there a fine line between what teachers can do, what schools can do? Where does the responsibility lie? And I would have to answer that with a question, whose responsibility has it always been? For a lot of the time, it's been Black communities through homeschooling movements we see within the Black community that we have to educate our own children ourselves. We've been placed in a situation where we have to educate our own children ourselves. So as we are trying to be more culturally relevant, culturally sustainable, we're also not meeting that mark in which Black parents are also removing their kids from these institutions so they won't continue to be damaged. While schools are still figuring it out, our children still have a place they have to go to learn. If it has to be us not working to educate our kids, if it has to be finding a home school that serves Black children in our own communities, we're having to equip our own selves with the resources, the knowledge to make sure that our children will not continue to be damaged by schools. How can something be viewed as being so liberatory, right? Education is liberation, but also be so damaging, also be so belittling to young kids, not just to kids, but often to Black parents and guardians that go to talk to teachers, that try to approach the principal, that have questions and they're being pushed away and shunned away. So I think it's a fine line, but it's something that we have to be willing to tackle. So the question is it a balance between? It is no balance. When we educate white children, do we ask that same question, that is it a balance? Do we ask those same questions, about, well, how do we do both at the same time? No, we do it. The system just does it. And so I think we have to step back and ask, why do we not have the same or equitable opportunities for Black children? If we already have them built into the system for white children, why do we not have certain opportunities, resources, systematic changes, social justice built into the system for all children? Why is it just for some children to begin with? I always kind of go back to that idea of, how can education in schools serve children that never wanted to have their first? The first day, it was never for Black children. It was never for Chicano children. It was never for biracial children. And so I think that we have a lot of digging up to do. We have a lot of digging up and understanding of what history has told us to do. And we have a lot of work. But I would pose that question, why don't we ask that same question to white children, white parents? It's never a balance. It's just already there and built in for them from the beginning. And that means something isn't there and isn't built in for the rest of our children, like my 4-year-old daughter.
As a writing teacher and a writing project teacher, I'm really struck by the act of writing that you're supporting the youth in doing, that they are being remixers and retellers, and really it's these stories that need to be remediated, not the kids, right? And I do think there's something really powerful. I was struck by you talking about how the older kids are starting to read these stories to the younger children. And that just strikes me as such a powerful piece to come out of this. Those texts, we often talk about the mentor texts that are being used, right? And that these are powerful mentor texts that the kids themselves are remixing and remaking. And how important that is, not just important, how critical that is in the mix. And then it makes me think also, because we're an educator network that works to educate teachers and pre-service teachers, much like Marquita, in what way are we bringing those mentor texts back to our work with our colleagues, right? Like how could we do that to start to sort of open up these conversations, and how should we think about reworking our own texts and thinking about that as writing project teachers? So anyway, I just was really struck by the creative and production, the way you're thinking about like producing the actual artifacts that are needed and working together with the youth to do that.
Also, if I can piggyback on that, what I really appreciate about this approach is the idea that in a system that's deficitizing the reading that Black girls are doing, what this does as an intervention is essentially, speak to their agency, right? They're not just readers of these pieces. They're critical. Yes, their readings are very important. Like culturally, for us to read these fairy tales well, we need to hear the readings that Black girls are doing. And if they're identifying, racism or issues that don't resonate with them in fairy tales, we haven't done a good job of reading them if we've silenced those critical voices. And the idea that they're important, their readings are vital, and then the idea that they also are authors and that they can help us with a way forward. I mean, it's important to communicate agency to young writers anyway, but it's also true of our society, is like, if we're not involving them in writing the next generation of texts that we'll read, we are going to continue with some of the same challenges we're facing. So I really appreciate how this counter fairy tale process asserts, authority back to these to young Black women.
Can I add this in? Because I think it's important, because there's been Black women and girls whose stories have already been written, autobiographies. There's lots of different ways to access resources that come from Black women and girls' experiences already. And so I think it's allowing Black girls in schools the opportunity to write their own, but then also bringing in others that have already been written. So there's definitely a duality there. And so it has to be coupled, because then you run into legitimization. If it's just your narrative, but then it's not, a wide understood narrative. And so even bringing in, some of the texts written by Maya Angelou, Bell Hooks, even looking at, incidents in the life of a slave girl, just as a starting place of discussion. So there's already pieces that have been written. So that doesn't just help Black girls, but that can help all students in understanding the different ways of writing, understanding the different ways that language is produced and thought about. And language is languaged itself, if that makes sense. And so there's already different, I think, resources and pieces to pull from, but we have to be able to, again, validate those in the classroom, even if the state curriculum standards don't say so. Obviously, you as a teacher have to follow certain standards, I remember as a U.S. history teacher, certain key words that we have to go over in preparation for the end of course exam. But if it says Rosa Parks, there's a lot that can be said about Rosa Parks, about the NAACP, about the role of women during the civil rights movement. And so there's different ways that we can bring in and access different stories that have also already have been written as well. Someone else want to add?
I was about to say the very same thing. I think my phone was muted. But for instance, there was a young Black girl named Marley Diaz, and she started this, and it's a hashtag, 1,000 Black Girl Books campaign, where she was looking for 1,000 books that portrayed Black girls as the protagonist of the story. And there's a website where you can go in, you can search for certain themes or certain keywords in filters to find these books. And, when you go into the library, are these books available to Black girls? Are they something that teachers can access? Do you have class sets of these types of books? There are so many different resources out there, for Black girls, starting a Black girl book club after school, or using the unofficial community centers of the Black community, like the beauty shop, okay, like the church, and other places where Black girls frequent with their families, that they have access to books that are about Black girls, that use Black girl narratives in a way that's affirming. And then to reiterate the point that Dorothy made, and that we've made in another piece that we're writing, but this doesn't just support Black girls, white boys, white teachers, all can benefit, and they need to read these stories, because if not, they're going to go through the system with the same stigmas, the same biases, the same misunderstandings about Black girls, and then become teachers and perpetuate the cycle yet again. And the last thing I wanted to say is that, a lot of the what we're talking about today, I've heard words like, we talk about like counter narratives, counter fairy tales, counter storytelling, remixing, redoing, re. Why can't this be the narrative, the story? Why does it have to be tangential? Why does it have to be juxtaposed? Why does it have to be an add-on, an ancillary to what is being learned? This is not something that we should do, as a kind act for people of color. This needs to be the curriculum.
To jump in on that one, as someone, I was an English teacher for 17 years. And seen trends come and go, and teachers hear about something, and because they want to reach their students, they jump on certain trends, and they may not have the understanding that they need, or even the training, or the development to make sure that they implement something with fidelity and authenticity, that it's a valid attempt. And so I'm just thinking about what Dr. Young was saying about why can't these just be the stories? And I've always felt that we really need to, if we really want teachers to change their habits, if we want schools to change their habits, then there has to be some understanding, some guidance that comes along with that. Because I've known teachers who've, like I said, heard of a trend, they went out without the understanding and implemented something that was not as effective, or it was probably more damaging than they thought was going to be. And so, or it wasn't effective as they thought it was going to be. It didn't achieve what they thought it was going to achieve, because they didn't have a full understanding of it. So this is not also just about selecting tales, or teachers having students tell a story from their own lived experience. It's about truly understanding what that story means, what that representation means, why, are they using particular language, and teachers understanding that, it's not just about picking a book that has a Black character in it. That Black character may not have been written by a Black author. It might contain a lot of deficit thinking. It may contain a lot of stereotypes, but just because the protagonist is a Black person, a Black female, that they're like, oh, well, here you go. And so it really comes with a true, deep, willingness to learn and understand the Black experience, the Black female experience, and then having the capacity to select the proper material, as well as how do you guide your children with that material. It's not just picking books with Black faces on the front, because I've seen that, and that does not work in the end. It does not achieve what we want our students and our teachers and our schools to understand about Black girls and their experiences. It has to go beyond just that.
And that reminds me of some of the more recent work, but really all of the work with Dr. Shaun Harper, really looks at, who's now at USC, the idea around developing this racial literacy. And so definitely with teachers, we really have to have a racial literacy. So not just cultural competency or make it relevant, but what is our teachers' own literacy around race? What is their literacy around these conversations? And even with some of the work with Dr. Robin DiAngelo, looking at whiteness, white fragility. What does it mean for white educators to have conversations about race? What does that even look like? And so we have to, I think, as what has been said, really deepen the conversation, not just around the resources that we're using, but who's writing those resources? How are certain characters depicted? Are they the antagonists in the story? Are they the main character? Who's the missing character or characters? And why are they missing? Were they not around during this same time period or era that this text was actually written? What does that then mean or say? We have to also start to think about who are the authors. That would be a great discussion for ELA teachers to have, is information around the author's own life history and stories, to help the students understand how they viewed their work when even writing the work. And so I do think there is, definitely a long place we have to go even now, in really trying to make the classroom more equitable, but also, again, going back to that racial literacy Robin DiAngelo has said even the white racial illiteracy, thinking about whiteness, thinking about the ways that educators approach certain literature is really based off not just their own cultural experiences, but also this idea of whiteness and not wanting to unpack whiteness in the classroom. And so I do think that there's a lot to be said around what teachers can do. There's a lot to be said around white students seeing teachers unpack their own whiteness when it comes to literature they use in the classroom, but also adding in the voices of Black girls in ways that validate them, in ways that highlight their brilliance and not deficits, and also in ways that are more asset-oriented learning and instruction as well.
First of all, I think you had a couple points I'd like to unpack, but I think also I want to be conscious of everyone's time. So it's really been powerful to hear your voices around this issue and specifically around this piece. And so just by way of thinking about maybe a last thought, you've talked several times about how the vast majority of the audience for this piece are going to be white educators, right? And so, and then as you touch on notions of white fragility, I just wonder if maybe you could, this might be too much to ask for a last thought, but the idea that I know that schools push back against this type of scholarship, and the idea that you're probably seeing a unique form of a very specific form of white fragility when you circulate these ideas among white educators. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, and if that's too leading in terms of a final thought, you can of course put in your own final thoughts.
Well, I know that, myself and Dr. Young, but also Ms. Foster can speak to this notion of white fragility in terms of the conversations and resistance to talking about race. And so when we think about race and racism, we teach courses, a lot of students, white pre-service teachers who want to educate children. But again, it's about whose children are we wanting to educate? Whose are we wanting to consciously or unconsciously exclude? And so when you think about cultural diversity courses that we teach, a lot of those courses are required, and a lot of students hate taking them. But these are going to be the future educators that will be in these classrooms, even from high school, middle school, even early childhood education, and how vulnerable are kids when they're in early childhood education. And so there definitely is resistance even before they enter into the classroom, pre-service teachers, with talking about race, with talking about cultural diversity. We think about critical race feminism and the role of intersectionality. So really trying to get white pre-service teachers to understand what that means, that intersectionality was based into literature from Black feminism, Black feminist studies. So really understanding the lineage of that. There's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of resistance, meaning through white tears. There's a lot of crying. There's a lot of passive aggressive behavior. And so even before teachers enter into the classroom, they're on these college campuses, and there's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of that white fragility. And so when we talk about white fragility, Dr. Robin DiAngelo really defines it as this kind of fragile state that someone has, this inability to want to have these conversations and dialogues about race, about racism, but also about whiteness. And she talks about ways that resistance is manifest through that challenging, is manifest through just crying, is manifest through those nonverbal cues of just not saying anything. So silence can be a form of that fragility. I know it's something going on inside of me to talk about this. It's anger, it's frustration to talk about Black people, to talk about racism, but I'm going to just remain silent. And I'm going to use silence as a weapon in the classroom. And so that silence helps no one, because you're not able to unpack what you're dealing with in your mind, how you're thinking about this, those feelings and emotions. But it also doesn't help because then you go into the classroom with those same feelings and thoughts and emotions that you never really unpacked a year or 2 or 3 years prior. And so it's really about this white fragility, what's going on through your mind. It's those emotional responses, those social emotional cues, those nonverbal responses that you have when you have discussions about race and racism. And that is a lot of what we see manifest itself even before pre-service teachers enter into that classroom door at that middle school. It's a tug and war process that a lot of pre-service educators go through. And so I would just say that, you know, the fragileness about race, I don't think it's just an education issue. I think it's a societal issue. Whenever something comes about race, no one wants to be racist, but everyone wants to call everyone else racist. And so I do think that it requires us to really have those brave conversations, but at some point it has to get past just conversations. If you're not able to do the work, we have to start thinking about, you know, other options for individuals' employment. If we just cannot have these conversations and then with action, right? Because then we'll start to get into this place where we're just having conversations and then nothing's being done. And a year has gone by, 3 years, 5 years, and nothing has been done. And so we do have to address those emotional cues. Also, Dr. Cheryl Matias writes a lot about whiteness. Whiteness studies is an actual body of literature. And so I do think that this comes with educating teachers, educating administrators. I'm going to also throw in educating social workers that are connected to schools. School counselors as well play a big role into this conversation. But we have to get to a point where we're having those conversations, we're providing those resources, but we're also moving towards substantial and effective action as well as change.
And if I can also add to that list, teacher educators and administrators in higher education as well. Because one thing that you know, what Dr. Hines was talking about, when we go into these classrooms and we're doing this work in these diversity courses, the resistance from the students is from birth to 20, 21 years old when they come into our classrooms. And you're having to, you know, to work with where they're coming from and what they've known to be true. And a lot of the discourse that happens, a lot of those conversations challenge what they've previously known to be true, but not only in their lived experiences, but also in the other classes that they're taking. So you have faculty who have not been in a classroom for 20 plus years, who are teaching the same things over and over, reading the book Little Martin. And after you're done, you don't unpack it. You just read the book and move on. And what is happening there? Or you talk about the literary devices in the book, or the similes and metaphors, or whatever is happening. And you're reading this book about a Black person that's not written by a Black person, and you're not talking about any of the issues. So when they have these 6 literacy courses that they're required to take, and they all speak to like similar kind of body of language, similar ways of teaching, and then they come into these diversity courses, these pre-service teachers, and what you're telling them not only is different from what they've lived, but also different from what they've been taught in those other courses. Then that fragility takes on whole new meaning. Like, well, what do you mean this is true? Well, none of my other professors said that. None of my parents, my family, you know, none of the 1 or 2 Black friends that I have, you know, my Black neighbor, a lot of my students will cite, you know, I have a Black friend, I have a Black neighbor, I've dated a Black man before, etc., as their kind of credit, if you will, we call street cred, right? Their acclamation, they think, to Black culture. But they come with these experiences, and oftentimes very shallow experiences, and just so very resistant. Then comes in, you know, the white fragility, the white women's tears. And then what I see is it translates at the end of the semester into what we call white rage. And so that is them beginning to either push back in class, or more commonly, as Dr. Hines points out, they're silent, but they're silent in their physical voice, but not with their ways of expression, which in my experience has been through things like the student evaluations. And so, you know, as Black female faculty, often we have conversations, we have written about our experiences in trying to teach these white teachers and pre-service teachers and in-service teachers and colleagues and administrators about our experiences in the classroom, in our post-secondary classrooms. And the cycle isn't just K through 12. Again, this goes beyond, you know, that middle school classroom that a white teacher and a black girl are sitting in. It goes up to higher education too. How can I teach these white teachers the counter fairy tale model if I'm not allowed to teach the black girls or these white women about black girls and the counter fairy tale model and other, you know, culturally affirming texts and models and notions and ideologies?
And, you know, I'll conclude by saying that my classroom experience is recent. You know, I was just on a campus around ending my assistant principalship around this time last year. So I bring with me a lot of, I always say, my stories. And I always introduce my course, you know, because I know race will come up regardless of the course that I'm assigned to teach, that I always introduce my courses with this statement: I'm here to disrupt your thinking. You've lived in bubbles your entire life, and I'm going to say things that's going to pop you out of your bubble, and you're not going to like it. And I understand, I tell them, I run the gamut of the emotions they're going to feel, the things they're going to say once they walk out of the room, and even talk about the evaluation piece. And I was like, I know it's coming, but I don't understand how someone can want to be a teacher and not understand that these bubbles have to be popped and that your thinking has to be disrupted. And if you are so uncomfortable, then this is probably not the occupation for you. And try it if you must. I mean, if everybody in your family has been an educator, or you've wanted to be an educator since you were in elementary school, and you need to get out there and find out if this really is the occupation for you. But I'm going to tell you what is ahead. And if you don't disrupt your thinking, if you don't disrupt your belief systems, then your students will find you out. They will know, and then you're going to have a whole different set of problems. And so I have found that the majority of them, by the end of the semester, are willing to acknowledge that they have their biases. Whether they change their practices or not, that you know, will be seen later, but they do acknowledge that they came to that class with some ideas about others that needed to be shaken up.
Christina, can I prompt you for a last word or something you're walking away from this conversation with?
Sure. I just want to reiterate the idea that this has been a gift, both your article and this discussion. So thank you. What am I thinking about? I'm thinking about my own teaching. I'm thinking about us as a collegial network of educators. I really appreciate the reminder, and I think your article actually does this nicely, and the reminder that there are so many rich texts out there already, and we need to get to know them, get to understand. And cross-culturally, we need to surface all these different texts. And I think the texts by Black women authors in particular need to be honored and brought to the center. So, and in the same article, you surface that, and you surface this process of counter fairy tale retelling and remixing. And I think, and you say multiple times that multiple approaches are needed. There's not one way to do this, that this really requires lots of work and lots of different approaches, and really centering Black girls' experiences in the classroom. And that these are, you know, a couple of ways to start doing that. Sometimes I think of them as like small moves you can make that have enormous impact, like places to start. And and that I just want to acknowledge that I know those are simply starts, and that we actually need to develop this further together. But just wanted to thank you for all your work around this.
Yeah, and I'll echo those thanks as a last word for me. I appreciate the when we talk about this article being a gift to us, I'm appreciative that it will be in a public place where folks are invited to come and have a public conversation about it. I think that your comments here today are essential for people to grapple with and think about, and particularly teachers who are serving communities of color and students of color. So just want to echo those thanks, and then to the outro, we're just really appreciative, and I look forward to that conversation that will materialize in the margins of your piece online. So thanks everyone for joining us here at Connected Learning TV to talk about marginal syllabus. Again, the article that is online now and available for annotation is Even Cinderella is White, Recentering Black Girls' Voices as Literacies of Resistance by Jemima Young, Marquita Foster, and Dorothy Hines. And it's at educatorinnovator.org is where you can find it. So for updates about this project and others, subscribe to the blog or sign up for our monthly newsletter at educatorinnovator.org. On Twitter, you can follow us at @innovates_ed. And please use the hashtag marginal syllabus. Thanks, everyone.